Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for your patience and welcome to this event, Black Reparations, a Transatlantic Conversation. The most important conversations we can have in the Academy and in our communities should first and foremost be founded not on affiliation, tacit consensus, or even implicit agreement, but on the willingness to create an environment that is conducive to the confrontation of ideas and to engage with the views of others within these environments. Today, in bringing together these 6 panelists, Ahmed Honeini and I, Nicole Gibson, will try to be catalysts for and facilitators of these kinds of important conversations on the subject of Black reparations. So we will begin this discussion by hearing 10-minute presentations from our 6 panelists, followed by a brief Q&A from Ahmed and me. Finally, we will open up the floor to questions from you, our online viewers. So let's get started. We'll begin with Nikki Frith of the University of Edinburgh. Nikki.
Thanks so much, Nicole. I'm going to move to a screen share.
Excellent.
Okay, so hopefully you're seeing the first slide there. Great. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak with all these wonderful people on this panel. I really appreciate that. So I'm going to just provide some information, a little bit of information from the research I've been doing over the last 10 years. And I'm going to provide an overview of the reparations movement within the French Republic, a campaign that is not really very well known when compared with its American and Caribbean counterparts, a bit like the UK-based movement, which I know Esther is going to talk about. So there are 2 specificities that differentiate the French reparations movement from its peers. And the first is that France still includes its overseas territories in the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean. And these are governed like any other overseas department, department of mainland France, which means that reparations activists will direct their claims directly at their own nation state, which is a bit different from the other independent nations of the Caribbean. And the second is that France remains the only European country to have actually recognized chattel enslavement and the so-called slave trade, or the transoceanic trafficking and enslavement of African peoples, as a crime against humanity through the 2001 Taubira law. So this also places activists, in theory at least, in a unique position because they have the legal justification to trigger a reparatory justice process against their own state. And yet, here we are in 2024, and very little progress has actually been made in practice. So my focus here is going to be on how reparations activists have been trying to make use of this Taubira law to press for the right to reparations. So I'm going to look at the genesis of that movement, and specifically focusing on the build up to the 150th slavery abolition anniversary in 1998, and then how that movement developed after 2001. I'm just focusing on one campaign. I recognize there are many others, but I'm going to look at the Martinique-based Mouvement International pour les Reparations, or MIR, and then its collaboration with a France-based organization called the Conseil Mondial de la Diaspora Panafricaine, and then the Guadeloupe-based Comité International pour les Peuples Noirs. So the campaign to recognize the legitimacy of reparations for African enslavements actually dates back to Paris in 1992, but it has much deeper roots in the French Caribbean independence movements of the 1960s and 70s. The reparations campaign then of the 1990s offered a kind of conduit to channel some of those pro-independence concerns, and many of the key players such as Garçon Massa and Lou Rienet overlap between independence movements and reparations movements. So this year, 1992, was pivotal. It was the year that marked the 500th anniversary of Columbus's voyage to the so-called Americas, or Abya. And objecting to Europe's celebration of these voyages, Gaston Maussa, who founded MIR, and Luc Renet, who would found the CEPN, organized a demonstration in Paris. And then a posthumous trial was also held against Columbus in Martinique. Christian Taubira, who was the French Guyanese deputy who would then go on to author the Taubira Law, attended that mock trial. So we have two transatlantic events that led to the call for reparations based around the 3 R's. So the first one, recognition for slavery as a crime against humanity, leading to reparation and then reconciliation. So roll on 6 years later, and we have the 1998 anniversary to the abolition of slavery. And this offered a window of opportunity in which to begin really pressing for step one, reparations, recognition, leading to step two, reparation. And it coincided with changes at an international level. The International Criminal Court was set up in 1988 in which to judge crimes against humanity. And there was also a global boom in public memories of slavery, for example, through UNESCO. So you have a supporting international framework in which the calls for reparation were being issued within France to get France to recognize the enslavement of African peoples as a crime against humanity. So I'm just going to look briefly at two examples. In 1997, the mayor of Le Lamentin in Guadeloupe, José Toribio, submitted a statement to the UN General Assembly to have slavery condemned as a crime against humanity and called for a trial at within the International Criminal Court. And then another example, perhaps much more well known, is in 1998, 23rd of May, there was a silent march through the streets of Paris to honor the memory of those enslaved. And this led to a petition for the state to recognize slavery as a crime against humanity. So Taubira would then go on to submit a draft law based on these kind of events to the National Assembly on the 22nd of December, 1998. And it began with Article 5 that stated that a committee of qualified personalities should be set up to determine the harm suffered and examine the condition for reparation in respect of this crime. That was a really important article. Political pressure was then maintained by community activists, and they hosted 3 events in 1998 and 1999 in Paris and Martinique. These were also attended by Taubira. And their discussions reveal the multifaceted nature of the legacies of this crime, as well as all the kind of solutions, reparatory solutions to address things like housing, employment, education, development, health, issues with access to land, self-esteem, identity, misrecognition, memorialization, and cultural recognition. And Taubira would then channel some of these demands into that draft law. But for example, she called for land redistribution in the overseas departments. But the debates that actually then took place in the Assemblée Nationale and the Senate led to the political decision to remove that key word reparation from Article 5. So the right to reparation was then replaced with this Article 4, which is the idea of a committee of experts to propose initiatives to guarantee that the memory of the crime continue for generations to come. So memory became the official policy of the French state, as opposed to reparation, or what they would term moral reparation. So it's worth noting that in the very same years that this wording of the Taubira law was being debated, the state also passed another law to provide reparations and restitution to the descendants of French Jews who had been directly affected by France's collaboration with Nazi Germany. So it's not that the French state was objecting to reparations and to reparations to descendants, but specifically to reparations for African enslavement. So despite that setback, Gaston Maussa founded the activist organization MIR in 2005, and it has a remit to defend the right of those whose ancestors were enslaved to reparation today. And this then resulted in a very lengthy court case lasting nearly 20 years that would circulate between the High Court and the Appeals Court in Martinique, the Court of Cassation, which is the highest court in France, and the Constitutional Court at a national level, and then the European Court of Human Rights. So for MIR and their lawyers, that the Taubira law had recognized slavery as a crime against humanity was justification enough for starting a reparatory justice process. And this claim was further supported by the fact that within French law, crimes against humanity are legally imprescriptible. So there can be no time bars that can be applied to prosecution. So MIR's legal struggle had two key demands. First, that provision be made for future reparations, and second, that an assessment of the harmful consequences of enslavement be undertaken to set an amount for that claim. The court cases would then bring to light four main battlegrounds, which I'm sure will be familiar to you, which is, first of all, to ascertain the existence or not of a statute of limitations to time bar legal action against the state. Second, to establish whether slavery was legal or not at the time of its perpetration. Third, to decide whether the Tolbira law represents a normative or a declarative law. And fourth, to assess whether the state today can still be held accountable for crimes of the past. So with the exception of the European Court of Human Rights, the French court would then consistently rule in favour of the defendant, that's the French state, and they argued that the legal action was time barred, so they said that too much time had passed to prosecute. They argued that slavery was legal at the time, meaning that no crime had effectively been committed, even though they recognised slavery as a crime against humanity. And they said that the plaintiffs were unable to prove transgenerational harm, meaning that the state could not be held accountable for crimes of the past or indeed any continuity today. Then France's uppermost court, the Court of Cassation, ruled on the 5th of February 2013 that the Tolbira law was merely a declarative law. So that means you can't use it to raise any legal claim or sanction. So although this judgment arose from a completely separate case, it effectively removed the right of MIR to take any kind of legal action. And that is what MIR would then challenge with the European Court of Human Rights. They won that case, and that allowed them to have their reparations case heard once again in October 2021, but the results were the same. The Court of Appeal, the Court of Cassation, both upheld the previous judgments in favour of the French state. So I'm just going to conclude here to say that on the one hand, perhaps this campaign could be viewed as unsuccessful, but on the other hand, as MIR's lawyers, Claudette Duhamel and Alain Monville pointed out, it has also made African descendants aware of their ongoing non-recognition in legal terms by the French state. So MIR has also successfully demonstrated the limits of France's judicial and indeed its constitutional system. They've proven it to be incapable of judging its own crimes against humanity, while revealing the inherent self-interest and coloniality of the French judicial system, that despite being separated from the state in theory, remains geared towards protecting state political interests in practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. That's excellent. I have some questions for you later about this. But let's move on to William and Kirsten.
Thank you. Good morning. So I want to address the flaws of HR 40, the legislation that's currently under submission that speaks to the reparations topic today. But before I do that, though, I want to share just the cover of the book under discussion, the Black Reparations Project, a handbook for social justice. While our comments, mine and Sandy's today, are going to be about the U.S. case, there is a chapter in the Black Reparations Project that speaks to international reparations issues and endeavors. So, more than a century and a half after the official end of chattel slavery in the United States, the idea of paying reparations is finally gaining some momentum. A congressional bill named HR 40, House Representatives Bill, after the 40 acres that the U.S. government promised but never delivered to the formerly enslaved, emerged from committee for the first time since the late Representative John Conyers initially introduced it in 1989. And there is some hope that it will eventually proceed to a vote. But unfortunately, even if the legislation passes, it's highly unlikely to deliver true reparations. On the contrary, it could undermine the whole project. Why some here today may ask, are people talking about reparations at all? Hasn't the United States already had a civil rights movement and a Black president? Let's assume for a moment, as I hope we all do, that race does not determine a person's abilities. It follows then that in the absence of racism, that the average wealth among races should also be roughly equivalent, or at least trending in that direction. Yet government data going back to the 1940s show a vast and persistent racial wealth gap. As of 2022, there is a $1.15 million gap per household in Black-white wealth. This difference, which now exceeds $16 trillion, reflects the extent to which centuries of slavery, Jim Crow laws, and nearly 100 years of white terror campaigns, disproportionate application of the Homestead Act, ongoing mass incarceration, which removes Blacks from the labor market, inequitable housing policies, predatory finance, and much more have enriched one race at the expense of another. Closing the gap is not only a moral imperative, it's also a growth opportunity. By providing financial resources to many of the United States' most disadvantaged, it could make the economy more resilient and unlock the productive potential of millions of people. So House Bill 40 has long been the only draft legislation to raise the issue of redress in the United States, at least since the Reconstruction era. Yet it does no more than call for the creation of a U.S. Congressional Commission to study and develop proposals while offering little direction on how to proceed. Reparations could end up defined as anything from an elaborate apology to the endorsement of piecemeal and woefully inadequate measures, such as a Vermont effort that invites white people to donate cash to Black people who sign up to receive it, or an Evanston, Illinois program that so far has made available a mere $10 million to compensate all of the Black families that the city of Evanston discriminated against in the housing market over 5 decades. Worse, H.R. 40 contains numerous structural flaws. Among other things, the commission would be exempt, the commission members themselves would be exempt from the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which ensures transparency in the form of public hearings, agendas, and periodic reports. 7 of the commission's 15 members, which oddly the bill considers enough to establish a quorum, so not a supermajority, not even a majority, but only 7 of the 15 would be a quorum, but they would be appointed by the administrative director from the, quote, major civil society and reparations organizations, end quote, of that person's choice. No elected officials would be allowed to serve on the commission, and members would earn salaries of as much as $172,000 per year. The potential outcome, an obscure, unrepresentative process in which co-opted members reach an unsatisfactory result, potentially discrediting the very concept. One comment on this question of salary, Say and I view this work of this commission to be a sacred mission, and we don't believe that those individuals should be paid for their effort. They would have access to an advisory, access to an administrative assistance team who would be paid. And certainly any expenses that commission members incurred while doing the work of the Reparations Commission should be reimbursed. But the assumption is that these are people who have jobs already in place or who have their own financial support. Their work is basically advisory in nature. They're reviewing the work that the administrative team would execute. It's not a full-time job, but we also view this as a sacred mission and don't believe these individuals should be paid. But further, a proper reparations program should rest on 4 pillars. Okay, so first, claimants must meet both a lineage and identity test. These would be individuals who were able to trace their ancestry to a person who was enslaved in the United States, and hence would have been eligible for the federal government's original 40-acre land grants. So we're speaking here of the descendants who were deprived of the ability to accumulate wealth across generations. So this is the debt that is long, long gone unpaid. We're talking about terror and legal segregation. And these individuals should have self-identified as Black, African-American, Afro-American, or Negro at least 12 years prior to the establishment of a reparations commission or program. Less than 1% of the country's Black immigrant population entered the country before the 1970s. This would be after the passage of major civil rights legislation. We talk about the community of eligibility, and this is the group that is, I should say, the California's Reparations Task Force established its community of eligibility as African American descendants of chattel, enslaved persons, or descendants of a free Black person living in the United States prior to the end of the 19th century. Unfortunately, though, this definition could allow for the possibility of individuals who live and self-identify as white to receive remuneration from the state of California. It's definitely problematic. A government agency run by professionally trained genealogists should be set up to assist individuals making their claims free of charge. So the second pillar, the redress should bring the average wealth of Black households up to the level of their white counterparts. So as long as the racial wealth gap exists, the account cannot be considered settled. So the elimination of the racial wealth gap is the second pillar. The third pillar, payments should be made directly to eligible recipients. This is how governments have remunerated countless groups, including Holocaust victims, as Nicola Firth talked about, but also Japanese Americans who were held in internment camps in the United States during World War II. More recently, the US government paid reparations averaging $2 million to families that lost loved ones during the 9/11 terrorist attacks. In addition, each of the Americans held hostage in the US Embassy in Tehran in 1979 to 80 was paid $10,000 per day of captivity, or about $4.4 million each. The fourth pillar, the federal government must pay the debt. This is the entity that gave itself the right and authority to enslave Black people and to institute nearly a century of legal segregation and white terror campaigns. It sanctioned, turned a blind eye to these campaigns involving the seizure and, importantly, the appropriation of Black property. But it's also the only entity, the federal government, with the capacity to pay the debt. Taken together, the country's city and state budgets amounts to about $3.5 trillion, a fraction of what is owed. So in closing, H.R. 40 will not deliver reparations to Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, and it should be scrapped. America deserves legislation based on strong moral principles, a congressional mandate to guide the nation in the payment of a debt that is now 156 years overdue.
So in the work that Kirsten and I have done, we've used the following definition for reparations. Reparations has three components: acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. Acknowledgement means that the perpetrator of the harm admits that they have committed damages to the population that's been victimized and simultaneously makes a commitment to engage in an act of restitution. The second component, redress, is restitution for the harms. And that typically has taken the form in previous cases where there's a victimized community. That's typically taken the form of direct monetary payments to the members of the victimized community. The third component is closure, which means that in the aftermath of a satisfactory redress arrangement, both parties will agree that the account is settled, and there'll be no further claims made by the victimized community on the perpetrators unless there is a renewal of the atrocities that have taken place or a new wave of atrocities are conducted against the victimized community. Now, we avoid using the term reconciliation because we don't believe there has ever been a moment of conciliation between the populations that have been subjected to slavery, particularly in the Americas, and the nations that were engaged in the process of legally administering the mechanisms of slavery. In addition, we do not actually use the language of repair, although we talk about reparations, because we think it's infeasible to actually repair the damages that have been done. What can be done is to compensate for the effects of those damages on the living members of the community that's been subjected to victimization. And we would call that an act of justice, not necessarily an act of repair. So These distinctions, I think, are important in terms of thinking about this conversation, but they're especially important in the context of trying to determine what public attitude is in the United States in particular towards reparations. So if we situate the form of redress as monetary payments to the members of the victimized community, we can do a very interesting assessment of how public sentiment has changed. In the context of the United States, in the year 2000, a survey that was conducted by Michael Dawson and Ravana Popov, two researchers at the University of Chicago, found that only 4% of white Americans endorsed monetary payments as reparations to Black Americans. A survey that was conducted in January 2023 by researchers at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst found that that proportion had risen to closer to 30%. So frequently you will find in the press the observation that 70% of white Americans are opposed to reparations for Black Americans in the form of monetary payments. But those reports typically don't indicate that in the year 2000, it was only 4% of white Americans who endorsed reparations in that form. So there's actually been a dramatic sea change in the position of many white Americans towards the concept of reparations. The increase for Black Americans has gone from about 70% to close to 90%. So we are in a position in which there is a momentum that could be ridden towards true reparations. Now, whether or not this will actually occur is something that we're not capable of predicting, but we're trying to make the most positive contributions we can personally to having that change come about. The last thing I'd like to mention in my remarks is the problem of detours or deflections from true reparations. And I'd like to mention too, Kirsten talked about the limitations of H.R. 40 and perhaps the possibility that H.R. 40 is actually a distraction from producing true reparations. But I would like to suggest that there are two others. One of these is the growing wave of state and local so-called reparations initiatives in the United States. So there are many municipalities that are engaged in what they are labeling as acts of reparations. And many people view this as a signal that the nation is moving in the proper direction. But there are some severe difficulties associated with doing reparations on a piecemeal state and local fashion. There are three problems. State and local reparations are intrinsically incomplete, inconsistent, and inequitable. Now, Kirsten did not actually provide you with a number on the amount of redress that is due for the purposes of eliminating the racial wealth gap in the United States. But the average household, Black and white household in the United States, has a differential of $1.15 million in net worth. And that is to say, the white household net worth is $1.15 million higher than the average Black household. And if we were to eliminate that disparity, it would require an expenditure of in excess of $16 trillion. The combined budgets of all state and local governments in the United States comes to less than $5 trillion. So from a mere numerical standpoint, it's actually infeasible for states and localities to meet a bill of that magnitude. Now, these individual efforts by states and localities are inconsistent because they're conducted in a decentralized fashion. There's no coordination between them, so you're getting a wide variety of projects that are labeled reparations, including what is essentially an anti-poverty program for all low-income citizens of the city in Providence, Rhode Island. To what extent that can be construed as a reparations project is not at all clear to us. And then the final dimension of problems with state and local reparations is that they're intrinsically inequitable. And that's because of the inconsistency across locations with the types of projects that are actually being pursued. As a consequence, what type of reparations an eligible recipient will get is contingent on where they live. And in the vast majority of communities in the United States where there is no discussion of pursuing a reparations plan at all, in those communities, I think there's 108,000 cities and cities and villages and throughout the United States, and approximately 45 to 50 are doing something that they're calling reparations. So if you live in the remaining vast majority of locations, you'll get nothing, even though you might be somebody who we could identify as being eligible for reparations. And so that's one detour. The second detour is actually a comment that many advocates of reparations actually make, which is to say reparations has to be more than some money, or that money is not enough. And, you know, of course, in a strict sense, money is not enough. In our book, From Here to Equality, we actually argue that it's important to accompany a plan of monetary payments with a substantive educational plan about the history of the United States. And this is especially important in an environment in which so-called critical race theory is coming under assault on a nationwide basis. We need truth-telling about the nation's history, and that should be part of a program of reparations. However, money is actually something that is intensely significant, particularly in the amounts that we're describing, that would alter the fabric of America's racial distribution of wealth in such a way that Black Americans could finally have the material conditions for full citizenship.
Thank you for that very concise and precise presentation. Do you guys want to add something else before we move on to the next presenter? We're okay? All right, so let's go on to Lucas.
Hello, everyone. I'm just gonna share my screen here. Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to be piggybacking on a lot of what Kirsten and Sandy were just talking about. For my contribution, I'm going to be discussing the growing Black reparations bill in the United States, and I'm considering two fundamental questions for any reparations claim. First, what is the cost? How do we calculate the amount due to compensate for these grave injustices? I know Sandy and Kirsten maybe gave a bit of a spoiler in terms of one of the ways that we'll approach that. But I think it's very important that we're transparent about these calculations because they're very large numbers, which makes sense. They're compensating for very large atrocities. But we need to be clear that we're not just throwing out these numbers. And when these estimates change, we need to show why they change. The second question I'm considering is when can reparations happen? People often think that reparations is maybe not feasible at any time. It has to be just the right time. And especially in cases where reparations claims haven't immediately been met, there's a circular logic that can take hold that if it hasn't happened already, it may never happen. So in this case, we'll see that the answer to the first question will help us answer the second question. And rather than asking when can reparations happen, we should reframe the question as how soon can reparations happen? So I want to discuss two approaches of how we might calculate the reparations bill for Black descendants of U.S. slavery. Both are featured in our book, The Black Reparations Project. The first method is from, Thomas Kramer at the University of Connecticut. It's featured in chapter 2 of our book, and it's somewhat illustrative. It features the itemization and summation of historical costs incurred by this group. And then the second approach, which is our preferred calculation, and is featured in Sandy and Kirsten's book, From Here to Equality, as well as our book, uses the modern racial wealth gap as a measuring stick for the present day effects of these historical costs. And I'm talking about these two approaches to highlight their shared trait that regardless of their calculation method, the amount owed is growing. So the first calculation is estimating annual costs of slavery and post-slavery discrimination. This is the Kramer approach. So to do this, his team identified the costs incurred by African Americans during each year of American slavery, so from 1776 to 1865, and then during each year of post-slavery discrimination from 1865 to the present. And this is as exhaustive a list of costs as possible. So considering anything from uncompensated labor to lost opportunities to acquire capital, to lost freedom, to pain and suffering, and so forth. And then once these annual costs have been identified, you can apply a nominal interest rate to find the present day value of each, the cost for each year, sum across the entire time frame, and that gives you the reparations bill. And again, this is largely illustrative. I want to focus on the growth of these annual costs, and highlight the speed with which these estimates increase, and highlight the costs of delaying reparations. So this table here is showing the total reparations bill had reparations been paid in 1860, so just before the Civil War. And the reason we're stopping in 1860 and not 1865 is during the Civil War, the data for the slave populations and such become very unreliable. So for clarity's sake, we're stopping in 1860. I'll highlight that this is just a subset of the costs that Kramer outlined in his approach. We're looking at the cost of deferred wages, so using census data to estimate the enslaved population for every year of American slavery, and then using annual wage rate data for unskilled labor and manufacturing workers to estimate the total level of uncompensated or total lack of compensation for these workers in that time period. And then similarly, using those estimates of the enslaved population and precedents from other reparations claims to quantify the value of their lost freedom. All that to say, had reparations been paid in 1860, the bill at that point, we can see on the right, is $500 billion. But as you probably know, reparations were not paid then. And anyone who has seen The Power of Compounding Interest knows what's coming next. The bill today is a lot larger. So with the more than 160-year-long postponement of restitution, the nominal bill compounding at again, a pretty conservative 3% interest rate, the nominal bill has grown more than 100 times over. So now we come to the second calculation, which Kirsten and Sandy already spoke about a little bit. That's using the U.S. racial wealth gap as our measuring stick. It's a much cleaner and a more efficient calculation. Every 3 years, the Survey of Consumer Finances conducts a cross-sectional survey of U.S. families, enabling us to estimate this racial wealth gap. And wealth, just as a quick refresher, this is the difference between what an individual owns and what an individual owes. And it's supremely beneficial for a lot of things, for unlocking opportunities through generational transfers primarily, so be that enabling homeownership, paying for university, avoiding debts in periods of crisis. And for our purposes, it is that ability for wealth to be transferred across generation after generation that makes it really useful for measuring not not past atrocities, but rather the effects of these past atrocities. And Kirsten spoke about this as well, that we're not just focusing, so I'll breeze through this a little bit, but we're not just focusing on the period of slavery, but also the post-slavery period, where there are numerous historical policies that inhibited asset building for Black Americans while providing those opportunities to white Americans, be it the settlement of the West, via the Homestead Act, be it ways in which whites were able to become homeowners through the GI Bill during the New Deal, or whether the suburbanization of America that largely created these neighborhoods for white Americans by building highways through existing Black neighborhoods and destroying the wealth that those communities had developed. So where does that leave us now? Sandy and Kirsten shared the most recent data, and we'll see that very shortly on this slide. These were actually the numbers when our book came out. So this is using the prior, the 2019 Survey of Consumer Finances. So we can see at this point in time, the racial wealth gap was only $841,000 per household. And in just a 3-year period, it has ballooned to $1.15 million. And quickly, I'll note that this is outpacing the rate of inflation by a significant number. So when we wrote the book, compiled the volume for the book, the reparations bill was about $14 trillion. And as Sandy and Kirsten both said, it's now north of $16 trillion. So an optimist might look at this and say, well, there's no compounding interest in this calculation. So unlike Kramer's, it won't automatically be increasing. And maybe there's ways to alleviate the racial wealth gap. Maybe we can take some indirect approaches like greater education for Black Americans or enhanced financial literacy, increase Black entrepreneurship rates, or take any kind of liberal approach like that. I will briefly spoil this by saying none of those approaches work, and continue to say that looking, and this is quoting from a 2018 report from the Cook Center called What We Get Wrong About Closing the Racial Wealth Gap. It's really important to note that wealth begets more wealth, and wealth is really the engine and the key that unlocks so many opportunities for families to generate more wealth for themselves. So they get more favorable terms of credit, they have more financial agency and choice, greater economic security, greater protection against the risk of economic loss, and many more opportunities to purchase appreciating assets that will then produce more and more wealth. And as it says there, it takes wealth to make wealth. I'll also add that here we've been looking at the absolute racial wealth gap of the $1.15 million per household. We can also see that during that over the history of the United States, for a while, the relative racial wealth gap has been actually decreasing from the Civil War. I believe it was about 56-1, the ratio of white to Black wealth. In the 1980s, it reached its lowest ratio, which was still a 5-1 white to Black ratio of wealth. But now that relative rate itself is also increasing. So I think this highlights the imminent need to do something rather than continuing to wait for wealth gaps to alleviate themselves. So where does this leave us? We have this massive racial wealth gap, one that is growing, and the only way to remedy it is with a transfusion of wealth. That would be the direct provision of wealth to eligible Black Americans in the form of reparations. We have seen that this is a growing bill, and as Sandy outlined in his comments, we've seen dramatic growth in support for reparations in the past 2 decades. So I will conclude by saying those fearful of a large bill should see the merits in doing something soon, because these demands are not going away and the price is only going up. So I know that was a bit of a sprint, but I'm happy to answer questions in the discussion period. Thank you so much, and thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Lucas. So just to be clear, we can get more information about the implications of wealth and slavery in chapter 2 of the book. Is that correct?
Yes, chapter 2 is by Thomas Kramer and a number of co-authors, and that really digs into some of those estimates that I was discussing, as well as some alternate estimates that are similar approaches that one could take.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. Okay, let's move on to Esther, please.
Hi, thank you, Nicole, and greetings to my fellow panelists. I've been listening to each and every one of you with great interest. So I'm going to speak about the framing and the context of reparations here in the UK. And in particular, I'm going to share perspectives from the International Social Movement for African Reparations, as some of us as grassroots activists, scholar activists, define it from a social movement's perspective. And it's important to note that the movement for African people to effect and secure reparations, otherwise stated as holistic reparatory justice, does have a long history in the UK, going back to the mid-1700s, but it's not really very well known. And much of the public discourse on reparations obviously comes out of the USA, and more recently, the Caribbean region, and in particular in relation to CARICOM states. Many of us take issue with that because reparations is a global movement. And if we look at the fact that we're speaking English, there is a perception that the framings of reparations, dominant framings of reparations that we hear, especially promoted in the mass media and that take up a lot of academic research, very much center European epistemologies of repair or reparations. And of course, in the UK, I don't speak for everybody. There are different personnel and different individuals and groups and organizations that are now advocating or championing reparations. But I'm coming from a particular perspective that traces a longevity, as I said, back to the 1700s. And that's important to note because the movement here has always been very Pan-Africanist, okay? And there are many objective and subjective reasons for that. Unlike the USA, we don't have the demographic population that there is there. And so what has happened in the UK, and because of the nature of the British Empire, many of us who were came directly from Africa or were born in the Caribbean or other parts of the Americas, or even were born here in the UK, we've kind of found a commonality of expression. But the most dominant traditions through which we can see this history of reparations organizing has been through Pan-Africanism. And recognizing that Pan-Africanism means, again, different things to different people. But one of the central thrusts of Pan-African organizing has been to center an African homeland, which many of us are dispossessed of, and even today lack citizenship of, if I think about myself in particular. Nevertheless, the desire to return to Africa, which has been sort of termed as repatriation, has been an integral part of reparations organizing of people of African ancestry and heritage within the British Isles and beyond. Now, that's important because the perspectives then that people are coming with are not just perspectives of being colonized and not having any memory or continuing any memory of our African homeland. Even those of us, in terms of my parents in particular, that were born in the Caribbean and South America, Guyana and Barbados respectively, there has still been a strong degree of African retentions within our own memory keeping and our own calls for repair. And so that's quite significant because it's not a broken history in the sense that we see ourselves as totally cut off and have become a totally new people. So if I think about more recent activism, especially from the early 1990s, a lot of inspiration was gained from the process leading towards the first, there was a reparations conference in Nigeria in 1990, but there was one that followed it in 1993, which was the first Pan-African conference on reparations for African enslavement, colonization, and neo-colonization. And that was organized by a group of 12 eminent persons under the auspices of the then Organization of African Unity. And that conference recognized that the issue of reparations for African people and people of African descent required the united action of Africa and its diaspora, and that it was worthy of support from the rest of the international community. So that framing of reparations in the UK has always been Pan-African, but particularly naming ourselves as African people, even if we were born here in the British Isles or born in the Caribbean. The identity very much has still been an African one. And with the forming of an organization, which was also a movement that had international reach in the early 1990s, known as the then African Reparations Movement, co-founded by the late Bernie Grant MP and many others, some of whom I'm organizing with today, such as people like Kofi Maoli-Klou, and many others. They decided to link different reparation struggles of people of African descent, rather than see ourselves as just an island of people by ourselves, i.e., quote, Black British. That concept of a Black British reparations movement does not exist here. Unlike, I would say, in the United States of America, where there are different perspectives on those that would be considered immigrant Blacks and those that don't meet particular eligibility criteria that are being developed based on lineage. So whilst in the UK, we also work with lineage, but we work with lineage in terms of a movement known as lineage restoration, which means that our lineage as people of African descent in Britain is connected to our global family, whether they're born in the Caribbean, whether they're born in the so-called Americas, or whether they're born on the continent of Africa. And we trace that long line of lineage. So a big part of the repair is about reconnecting with a sense of African identity and personality, as a way of forging a claim that has teeth and that actually is inclusive of many different African populations. Although our histories of the claims or the causes for which we may seek reparations may slightly differ, but there are still interconnections. So yes, we're talking about African chattel slavery. We're also talking about the period of colonialism. And in a continental African context, we're looking at the recent history of the carving up of the continent of Africa at the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885. So that significantly impacts the way that we see ourselves, and also the harm that we articulate requires repair. Yes, so that dismemberment of African people and our power base, separation from our motherland and our homeland, our lineage, our languages, our peoples, our nationalities, our ethnicities, becomes part of our reparations claim. And so when the African Reparations Movement founded in 1993, they had a foundational conference that was held in a city called Birmingham in the UK, in England in particular, and they came up with a declaration. And one of the things that was said, and this conference was attended by many different people of African descent, some arguably might have self-defined as Black British, some definitely would have been born in the Caribbean, and some directly born in Africa. But the Birmingham Declaration stated that we had to accept our responsibility and obligation to our ancestors for ensuring that the African identity is proclaimed, maintained, and developed, and that Africa is restored to its rightful place at the center of world politics. And therefore, that declaration called on all people of African origin in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Europe, in the Americas, and elsewhere to support the movement for reparations and join forces with a view to forming a strong, united front capable of exposing, confronting, and overcoming the psychological, economic, and cultural harm inflicted upon us by peoples of European origin. So that is really the bedrock of reparations organizing here. As I said, it's always been Pan-Africanist, and our sense of repair, we do use that term repair, and going back to the root of the term repair, coming from reparation, coming from repare, and this is where we also make claims around knowledge systems and epistemologies. And the movement in the UK is very much based on using African-centered epistemologies of repair, recognizing, as Indigenous American Yaqui professor Rebecca Sosi has argued, there's no universal or uniform theory of reparations that fits all groups, all peoples, all cultures, all nations. And so using African-centered epistemologies of repair, we can trace desires to return to Africa, to reunite our family, to stop the harms of enslavement and colonialism, and obviously racial capitalism, as being integral to the activism for reparations. And so our framing of African reparations, therefore, is transnational, not only Pan-Africanist, and it recognizes the way in which the British Empire brought us into different types of subjugation, not only with people of African origin, but by those also it colonized in Asia and other parts of the world. And so you will often see a recognition of the reparation struggles of other peoples, even if they are not of African heritage. And we identify those activists as being activists from what we refer to as the People's Reparations International Movement, of which the International Social Movement for African Reparations is a part. So to conclude, I would say the big picture of what African reparationists in Britain have been seeking to effect and secure. We deliberately avoid the terms like just payment of reparations, because we believe that whilst compensation is an aspect of reparations, and particularly under international law, it is not the only aspect of reparations. And one of the key aspects of reparations that we emphasize is the need to stop the harm. We do not accept and we do not see the world as it is as being the world that we have to live with, and the world, you know, we do not accept British Empire or US Empire. And so our reparations is very much also decolonial in terms of imagining that we can have a different world, and recognizing that with the increasing multipolar world that is forming, that there is a decentering of the so-called Europe and USA. And so in the rise of people's struggles for repair, where people themselves are reclaiming their right to land, their right to reestablish their power base, their right to also form those alliances geopolitically of their family members and extended family members. So the vision that we have of repair includes a repaired Africa that does not preserve those borders of 1884, 1885. And that kind of goes alongside movements for Pan-Africanism, even on the continent of Africa, where there is an attempt to form a united Africa, albeit at this time preserving the colonial borders, but movements of resistance on the ground where we can trace our origins, because we do DNA testing. And some of us can trace our origins back to Senegal, to Mali, and all these other places where today we see revolutionary struggles unfolding, such as in the Alliance of Sahel states, where they are transcending those colonial borders. So that for us is very much part of the struggle for reparations. And whilst we've had movements like Black Lives Matter, we do not feel that as people of African descent, our lives will matter in the diaspora when our homeland is being recolonized and is actually weakened. So part of our struggle is about the local organizing for reparatory justice, irrespective of whether we want to go back to Africa or we want to stay wherever we have made home on planet Earth. We locally link our interconnected struggles so that we can actually bring about that post-African world order that we see as being a Pan-African union of communities that we refer to as Ma'atu Buntu Man. And that Ma'atu Buntu Man is also being forged as a result of the allied struggles of other reparationists, other people's struggles, who themselves are reclaiming their wrestled away sovereignty. So that's what I would say. For us, it's the big picture of literally repairing the world. And we do see repair as important. And we recognize that the polycrisis that we are facing means that any solutions and remedies that we are seeking to effect and secure have to take into consideration collapse in society because of the impacts of the worldwide climate and ecological crisis that disproportionately impact people of African heritage and ancestry, indigenous peoples and other peoples who've experienced European settler colonialism, which means that we have to rethink and reorder our way of relating to each other. And this Matubuntu man actually is premised on satellite communities in the diaspora called Ma'atubuntu Jamas, which are Pan-African communities. And we have one in the UK that is linking with similar self-repairing communities in the Caribbean and on the continent of Africa. So we can move from having these contested zones that we have with colonial Bantustan nation states in Africa to actually having liberated zones, as was articulated by African reparationist Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah with his vision of a united Africa. And I will stop here.
Thank you, Esther. Okay, I want to move on to Keval.
Hi. Thank you. Thanks for having me on the panel. And thanks to Kirsten and William and everyone who contributed to this text, to this volume, to this handbook. It's been a pleasure to read it this week. And thanks to Lighthouse and Nicole for organizing today. It's a very important challenge that has been done, that has been accepted in the authors in bringing this compilation together. And I'm sure it's taken a heavy toll. So my heartfelt congratulations to all of you. And on the reading that I did this week, I've got a few observations that I'd like to make. So my sincere, humble apologies if I've misunderstood. But what I wanted to do is to think about the ways in which closing the racial wealth gap that's outlined in the book as the main target that reparations, as outlined in the book, is trying to achieve, and what would be the effects of that. I mean, as Esther was talking about, in an era in which we're evidently seeing racial capitalism play out, you're seeing the incomes of people, some people raising, and that causing climate change. You're seeing the value chains of consumers in the US have a direct impact on mining activity or fossil fuel extraction in Africa. And you're seeing increasing militarization across the global South in order to have a certain level of lifestyle that is afforded to the privileged few in the US, just by virtue of the way in which capitalism operates and the way in which it needs to have this Western hegemony attached to it. And that Western hegemony is a continuation of 400 years of control and domination over most places on the planet. So I think that was an area that was missing. So what considerations are being made for this general expanse of capital that would then enter the US economy, and the trickle-on effects that would have in a global sense, actually to Black people around the world, on which whose labor is extracted in order to make products and consumer devices or any sort of services here in the US. The second and I guess related issue is then when you have an increase in capital going into the economy, you're, as has been pointed out by authors, you're going to maintain the kind of features of capitalism, right? So what are the features of capitalism? That it's an inherent class-based system. You're going to drive inequality, so that will still exist. How do we consider that inequality will still be a feature there? The book talks about housing and healthcare and education disparities. But I think it's important to assert at this point that in order for capitalism to actually function, it has instituted those disparities. These aren't accidents that because some policymakers or civil servants got it wrong. These are absolutely explicit features of the service of the economy, where racialized and gendered bodies are more precarious in order to make capitalism function. So how is that dealt with as well? And the other consideration or observation that I wanted to make is in relation to how we use examples of reparations that have been paid. So predominantly, there's a number of times in the book the reparations paid to Jewish people by Germany is repeated. But what's not discussed in the same, I guess, at the same time as that, is recognizing that Germany was a defeated state and was forced to do so by the US. So if we're making the argument, and I think we are, which is that we're having to hold up this total economy that has been created as a result of slavery and colonialism, not just explicit Black labor. It's the fact that Black labor that was enslaved made capital, but it wasn't just the interest that has increased over time. It's the ability for capital to have a leverage effect. So leveraging so if you take an example of that would be, look at stock options on Wall Street, for example. If I have $100, I can take out an options contract over $10,000 worth of stocks. So, and that $10,000 worth of stocks, I could then go elsewhere to say, look, I have this claim for $10,000 worth of stock, and I can go and use investments and do other things. And that creates this leveraging effect. So the impact that Black people had in the US in terms of the economy is far more than what's outlined in the book, actually. I would say that it's total capitalist production that we need reparations from. So then if that is the case, we're then getting, and we're comparing that with the situation with Germany and reparations to Jewish people. Germany was defeated, then I would argue that actually we need to defeat capitalism in order for reparations to fully take place. That is the entity in which the example of Germany reparations can hold true, because that is the defeated entity. If for us, it's from my perspective in terms of reparations, it's the entity of capitalism that we must defeat, or at least have the conversation around Western hegemony or US hegemony, US white supremacy, in the conversation that we need to, this is what we ultimately need to dismantle. So it's really, I guess what my main comments are talking about, like, what is the impact of Black capitalism? Right? What is that? I think we have to have the conversation at the same time that as has been alluded to, it's not just, I'm not arguing for saying that reparations is more than a check. Absolutely, we need capital today. We need capital today, as various people have outlined, to heal, to repair from the known and unknown myriad of traumas that are required, or that have been forced upon enslaved people and descendants. But what is the What is the connection to the economy? I think that was something that I would like to kind of hear from the authors about more.
Yvonne, in the interest of time, thank you very much. I'm going to have to cut you off only because I want to use the last minutes that we have to open up, not for our questions, but for the people on the live stream. Thank you very much, Keval, and my apologies for cutting off.
My pleasure, no problem at all. Thank you very much.
Is an interesting analysis. That said, Ahmed, is he there? Ahmed, I'm gonna hand the platform over to Ahmed to read the questions coming in from our viewers.
Yes. Thank you so much, Nicole. We have a number of questions. The first from Sean. Thank you for these presentations. Reflecting on Kirsten and William's thoughtful contribution, how would they challenge those who argue it is better to have a flawed or incomplete system of reparations sooner than holding out for something, quote, imperfect that may never come?
So, we believe that the true reparations is a federal government proposition. These other initiatives that people are mislabeling, we think, could go forward, but they should not go forward under the label of reparations. What they more accurately should be described as is racial equity initiatives or atonement initiatives. I mean, these are basically things that cities and states should have been doing all along. They're not reparations. Reparations, again, is an effort that will primarily significantly eliminate the racial wealth gap. But why not do both and? We can certainly see circumstances where cities and states would push these programs that would eliminate discrimination in housing, for example, or make certain that all of the city's commissions and committees the personnel look like the population of the people in those cities, but call those racial equity initiatives and pursue them, but use equal amounts of money, muscle, effort, influence to push for true reparations from the federal government.
Yeah, I'd like to add that there's a quotation from Malcolm X that we really, really love, where he talks about a situation in which somebody has plunged a knife 9 inches into his back. And he describes the process of removing the knife as easing the pain. But ultimately, he says, once the knife is fully pulled out, that's not the equivalent of healing the wound. And we like to argue that reparations is healing the wound. It's the act of compensation. It is not the act of eliminating the harm. Both have to be done, but we have a greater opportunity to engage in the process politically of pulling the knife all the way out if Black Americans have the kinds of resources that we conceive of as being associated with a true reparations plan. Indeed, and I think this is partially a response to the questions that Keval is raising. If you would like to see the type of social transformation that you are calling for, I don't think it could happen in the United States in particular without a very different set of economic resources that could translate into political action on the part of the Black community in the United States. And there's no guarantee that the Black community would necessarily do the right thing. But certainly the Black community under current circumstances doesn't have the capacity to have significant political efficacy. One last related point is I'm a longtime advocate of what we refer to as an economic bill of rights for the 21st century. And this includes a set of universal policies that could be applied that would be transformative in the United States. If you believe the United States is fundamentally a capitalist society, we could make the argument that these types of proposals would have a fundamental transformative effect on that society. This would include a federal job guarantee, the guarantee of medical care. It would include the establishment of a public banking system. It would include a program in which every newborn infant receives an asset, a financial asset, that could be calibrated on the basis of the wealth position of their families, what we call the baby bonds proposal. But all of these are proposals that would be designed for the benefit of all Americans. They would not constitute a specific plan of compensation for the Black American population whose ancestors were enslaved in this country. And so I'd like to distinguish an economic Bill of Rights from a reparations plan, but I'm an advocate of both.
Thank you very much, William. This from Kit, who thanks you all for these generous contributions. He'd love to hear from the editors of the book, so Lucas, Kirsten, and William, about the hopes that they have for how it might be read and circulated.
Lucas, would you like to take this one, or?
Yeah, happy to talk about it. I mean, I think I don't know if we have anything more specific than saying that this is meant to be an accessible volume read by a lot of people in a lot of different spheres. I mean, there are applicable political takeaways for this, but just as much as we hope everyone in Congress reads it, we want activists to read it. We want teachers to teach it in their classrooms, and anyone. I think it's a volume that, no matter how steeped in this discussion you are, there is something for you. So I don't know. I have I could talk about the grand designs that I have for the distribution of this book, but I largely think it should be read widely and constantly, and before it gets banned in a lot of our states and classrooms.
Yeah, I think our grand dream is to have the book contribute to the process of changing who is in Congress in the United States. We won't have a reparations plan adopted in the United States with the existing Congress. So let's take that around. The other thing is, I think that there's a dimension of each one teach one in this context, that folks who have read the book and think that it's useful, they'll pass it on to someone else. And thank you very much to Lighthouse for sponsoring this event, where we have an opportunity to share the book with the folks who are in the audience today.
We have learned of a number of groups, book clubs, that have selected the Black Reparations Project as their topic and assigned chapters to individual members to present to the group, which I think is an excellent way to work through it and to discuss these issues.
Thank you very much. This from Jan. So much of the reparations initiative is so concrete and practical. If the political will existed to implement it, what do you think we need to reach the cultural tipping point for that, which sort of leads beautifully on from the point that William was just raising. So please, William. So
thank you, Jan. I love the idea of imagining a world when, politics is not an issue for the reparations topic. But, so presuming that Congress is still relevant, right? I mean, we could have a world in which, the president of the United States decides that Congress has no powers whatsoever. But let's assume that Congress still has power and is relevant. I've held belief for quite a long time that you need, in this country at least, we need to have celebrities who appeal to Americans of every generation step up to the podium and say that reparations must be paid by the U.S. government, and it should be paid to Black Americans of U.S. slavery. I think it would be extremely helpful if world leaders across the globe would use their power and muscle to say, yes, if this is the case, that their nations enslaved people of African descent across the globe, I think especially Portugal would be, an ideal country given the extent of the slave trade in Brazil. But if they would come together and acknowledge their involvement and the extent of the harm, and also commit to the elimination of the racial wealth gap in their countries for that community of eligibility. And then importantly, if they would enforce the mandate through the courts and also with military power. I mean, we are very convinced that in the United States, at least 30% of white Americans would oppose actively a reparations initiative, and probably with violence, and that this is something that the federal government would need to be prepared for. And my guess is that you might have similar portions of whites in other countries who would be who would be disposed to violence. And so that is something that I think that the governments in each of these places that reparations would take place would need to prepare for in order to protect the interests of the recipients of reparations.
Before we go on to our next question, I just want to make a point. First of all, thank you for that excellent presentation there. I also want to say that one of our leading poverty scholars in America, Matthew Desmond, has gone on record for being for the case of reparations. I want to piggyback on what you've said and reinforce what you've said there, Kristen. I also want to say that we're going to go over 10 minutes since we started 10 minutes late. I'll give the podium back to Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Nicole. This is from Catalina, who found Esther's contribution really striking and insightful. It feels very rooted in the present as well as the past, and it's very interesting to hear that UK context. Is there dialogue between these different strands of reparations work that you can touch on, please, Esther?
There is some dialogue. I remain involved with NCOBRA, which is a big pusher of HR 40, and I've been following a lot of the critiques of it. I co-chair their International Affairs Commission and have been involved with NCOBRA for about 20 years, off and on. So there's been a lot of mutual dialogue, but also joint action that has happened between grassroots forces who are organizing within coalitions, not only in the US, but also here in the UK. We've organized joint conferences together on the continent of Africa. Myself and Nikki are both co-founders of, with Professor Joyce Hope Scott and my colleague Kofi from PARCO, co-founders of INASAR, the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations, that does facilitate transatlantic dialogue, critical discourse, joint strategies and tactics. So there's a lot of these initiatives happening. And also I would say there's been influencing of these perspectives that I've been sharing with scholars, with scholar activists, both within establishment academia and grassroots academia, because for me, what I'm sharing is the knowledge that is coming from social movements that are knowledge producers. And actually we develop our own institutions to pass on these ideas. And these ideas have been traveling. They've been, enabled us as INASAR, the International Network of Scholar Activists for African Reparations, to secure Arts and Humanities Council, Research Council resourcing to further research the way in which the ideas that are coming from African communities on the ground, both in the diaspora and on the continent of Africa, are actually being deployed in praxis, and in particular calls for rematriation, where there's some synergy with indigenous ethnicities and nations, so-called tribal groups in the USA, who are also using a framing of rematriation to return to land back. And there are different variations of that being practiced across the diaspora, African diaspora and Africa. And also another framing around repair that looks at repair holistically, given the polycrisis that we are facing. And in the UK, what we refer to is communities who are aware of collapse, an impending global socio-economic political collapse, and what communities on the ground are having to do to not only resist this collapse, but to build alternative systems of economy, of actually relating to land, of actually producing goods, which is all part of the reparations and self-determination agenda. If we're saying we no longer want to live under colonial diktats, then what are our alternatives? So this is a rich movement that is happening, and a big part of it is the knowledge foundations upon which we stand.
Thank you very much, Hester. And this is the last question from the audience. And this is a question that seems to be posed to all of the panelists. So this is from Mary, who is fascinated by Esther's contribution and her perspective on reparations as a global movement that has Pan-African roots and linked reparations struggles. It seems there is a distinction between an approach to the subject as academics versus activists. And so do the panel see a distinction between reparations as a movement versus as a policy initiative? So I'll throw that out there.
Yes. Well, I would like to think that there is not a distinction that's based upon whether individuals are doing this from the standpoint of academic scholarship or whether they're doing this from the standpoint of grassroots activism. I think that there are cleavages within both camps, and those cleavages are somewhat reflected in dimensions of the conversation that we're having today. But I don't think it's a question of an academic perspective versus a non-academic perspective. I think there's differences in perspectives among academics, and there are differences in perspectives among individuals who are primarily engaged in grassroots activism.
Ahmed, would you mind reading Gillian Stokes' statement?
Absolutely. So Gillian says, this has been the most eloquently presented case for reparations. I have been particularly moved by the diversity of perspectives put forward. It has made me think more deeply about the interactions of trauma that exist for peoples of African descent, all of which have never truly been addressed. Whether reparations can heal these traumas is one of the questions that has rung out throughout this session. Thank you to all of the panelists, and thank you, Nicole and Lighthouse Books, for hosting this important event. And ditto. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Gillian Stokes, for that eloquent ending to this event. I couldn't have done it better myself, so I won't try. I just want to take this moment to thank my partner in crime, Ahmed Honeini, to thank the Lighthouse Bookshop for providing this platform and giving us those extra minutes. Also, I want to thank Nikki Frith. I want to thank William Darity Jr., Kirsten Mullen, Lucas Hubbard, Esther Sanford Thorte, and Keval Baradia. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Keval? I'm massacring your name, and I'm sure
It's fine. Don't worry at all.
Esther Sanford, Jose. We need to work on that. We'll see each other in future events, Esther. We can work on that, my pronunciation. But suffice to say, thank you all for coming to this Black Reparations Transatlantic conversation. And it's not over. This has been recorded. Please feel free to come back into the Lighthouse Bookshop platform to use this recording in your classrooms, in your events, however you see fit. But this is a dialogue that can continue to happen in your own global environments. So please do come back and view and review this recorded event. Thank you all very much. And have a nice evening.